The normal day. The day did not announce itself as different. There was no interruption in the sky, no tremor beneath the ground, no alert flashing across screens to warn that something fundamental was about to fail. Morning arrived on schedule, light slipping through curtains with the same familiar softness it always had. Alarms rang. They were snoozed. Coffee machines hummed, doors opened and closed. Everything behaved exactly as expected. People stepped into their routines without resistance. Trains arrived. Elevators stopped on the correct floors. Traffic lights changed colors with practiced precision. The city breathed in and out, steady and unquestioned. If reality had a pulse, it was strong and regular, giving no reason to suspect weakness. Phones lit up with notifications. Messages were sent. Some were answered immediately. Others ignored with the casual confidence that there would always be time later. Weather apps refreshed and displayed forecasts that felt reassuringly ordinary. Nothing suggested that this day deserved more attention than any other. At work, conversations began the way they always did. Complaints about sleep, comments about the weather. Half jokes repeated from yesterday and the day before that without anyone noticing the repetition. Meetings were scheduled, rescheduled, then started a few minutes late. Keyboards clicked, pens scratched paper. The machinery of daily life moved smoothly, almost beautifully in its predictability. News outlets reported developments that sounded familiar but unremarkable. The tone was urgent, as always, but the content blended into the background noise of constant information. Screens displayed faces speaking with practiced seriousness. Words flowed. Nothing seemed out of place. Time advanced with quiet authority. Minutes passed. Hours followed. Lunch arrived, then ended. The afternoon settled in, heavy but manageable. The world continued to function, not because anyone was guiding it carefully, but because it had learned how to run on habit alone. And yet, beneath the surface of this flawless normality, something subtle had stopped. There were no new moments being created, only the appearance of movement. The day felt complete, full, and active, but strangely sealed. Like a photograph that convinced you it was alive simply because you had seen similar ones move before. No one questioned it. Why would they? Normality is persuasive. It disarms suspicion. It teaches you to trust repetition, to believe that continuity is proof of progress. Reality relied on that trust, because as long as everything looked right, no one would ask whether it was still updating, whether this moment was truly new, or simply the same one being experienced again with slightly different angles. The day continued, confident and uninterrupted, and almost everyone accepted it without hesitation. No new events. By late morning, the world was still busy, but it had stopped advancing. At first, the absence was too subtle to name. Nothing had gone wrong. Streets were filled, offices were loud, and screens continued to glow with constant updates. The machinery of the day was running flawlessly, yet beneath the motion, something essential was missing. There were no new events. News channels remained live, banners sliding across the bottom of the screen with the same urgency they always carried. Breaking news appeared again and again, but the story never changed. The footage was identical. The phrasing was identical. Even the pauses between sentences felt rehearsed, as if the broadcast itself had learned a script and refused to move past it. People noticed the repetition only as background noise. Information fatigue had trained them well. They assumed they had simply missed earlier updates, or that nothing important had happened yet. After all, quiet days existed. Slow news cycles were normal. The world didn't owe anyone constant novelty. But this was different. Emails arrived but said nothing new. Notifications chimed, announcing messages already read. Social feeds refreshed endlessly, presenting the same posts in slightly altered orders, like shuffled cards that somehow produced the same hand every time. Comments repeated. Reactions froze in familiar numbers. It felt less like stagnation and more like containment. Like reality had drawn a boundary around the present moment and decided nothing beyond it would be allowed through. Conversations continued, but they no longer accumulated meaning. A question asked in the morning was answered the same way in the afternoon. Anecdotes returned, perfectly intact, with no awareness that they had already been told. People laughed at the same lines, nodded at the same conclusions, and moved on without realizing they were moving in place. There were no surprises, no accidents, no spontaneous disruptions that usually broke the rhythm of the day. Trains arrived on time without exception. Phones never rang unexpectedly. Even mistakes were rare, as if error itself required something new to exist, and nothing new was permitted. Time, however, kept insisting that it was passing. Clocks advanced. Schedules shifted forward. Deadlines approached, then moved aside, leaving no trace of pressure behind them. Lunch came and went without anyone remembering what they had eaten. The day was full of moments, but none of them left marks. It was as if reality had exhausted its inventory. Every outcome had already been used. Every possibility already accounted for. The system continued to display motion because motion was expected, but generation had stopped. There were no fresh consequences, only rehearsed ones, replayed with convincing accuracy. To most people, the day felt unusually smooth, comfortable even. Problems resolved themselves before becoming noticeable. Decisions carried no weight because every choice led to the same result. The absence of resistance felt like peace. But peace without progression is not rest. It is suspension. Somewhere, deep beneath perception, cause and effect had loosened their connection. Actions no longer produced futures, only echoes. The present stretched outward, repeating itself just enough to disguise its own emptiness. And still, no alarm sounded. Because the world had not stopped functioning, it had stopped changing. Reality did not collapse. It did not glitch. It simply failed to introduce anything new into the sequence. Like a system that continued running after losing access to its database, it relied on cached data, replaying what it already knew how to show. For most, this was invisible. After all, how often does anyone stop to ask whether a moment is genuinely new or just convincingly familiar? The day went on, polished and intact, and almost no one realized that nothing had actually happened at all. The loop. The repetition did not arrive all at once. It revealed itself slowly, like a pattern you only see after staring too long at something ordinary. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence, a misremembered moment, a lapse in attention. The mind is generous with explanations when reality behaves strangely. A cashier smiled and said, "Have a good day," in the exact same tone as before. No variation, no fatigue. The words landed with unnatural precision, as if lifted from a recording rather than spoken by a person. The customer nodded, already forgetting they had heard it moments earlier. Then it happened again. A coworker leaned back in their chair and repeated a story they had already told that morning. Same opening sentence, same pause halfway through, same laugh at the end, arriving right on time, like a cue being hit. No awareness flickered behind their eyes, no sign of recognition. The loop was clean. Too clean. It wasn't confusion or memory loss. People weren't lost inside their own minds. They responded appropriately to questions. They navigated traffic, typed passwords, recognized faces. Intelligence remained intact. Consciousness appeared uninterrupted. Only behavior repeated. Small loops formed first. Sentences, gestures, routines. A hand reaching for a phone at the same second each minute. A glance at the clock that always lasted exactly 3 beats. A sigh released at the same point in a conversation, no matter how many times the conversation restarted. Reality had learned how to imitate itself perfectly. The unsettling part wasn't the repetition, it was the lack of resistance. Normally, repetition frays at the edges. People hesitate. They interrupt themselves. They realize something feels off. But here, the loop executed flawlessly, as if self-awareness itself had been bypassed. Each repetition reset the moment without erasing memory, because memory wasn't required. The behavior ran independently, like a background process that didn't check whether it had already completed. Somewhere between observation and action, choice had been removed. Those who noticed it felt the sensation before they could describe it. A pressure behind the eyes, a delay between intention and outcome. They spoke words that felt pre-selected, arriving in their mouths before thought could approve them. They tried to interrupt the loop. One person asked a question mid-sentence, hoping to derail the script. The response came anyway, unchanged, uninterrupted, flowing past the interruption as if it had never occurred. The loop did not adapt. It did not correct. It simply continued. Others attempted unpredictability, sudden movements, unplanned decisions, breaking routines deliberately, but unpredictability collapsed into familiarity. The same outcomes surfaced regardless of the path taken to reach them. It became clear that events were no longer being generated, only replayed. Time moved forward, but experience folded inward. Moments no longer followed one another. They stacked. Each repetition laid over the last, aligned so precisely that the seams disappeared. From the inside, it felt like continuity. From the outside, if there had been an outside, it would have looked like stasis pretending to flow. The loop was not a prison. It was a convenience. Reality had discovered that it could save resources by reusing what already existed. No new variables, no recalculation, just execution. People inside the loop did not suffer. They did not panic. They did not resist. Why would they? Their emotional responses repeated too. Comfort returned on schedule. Frustration never escalated. Fear never crossed a threshold. The loop regulated intensity. Nothing became unbearable. Nothing became meaningful. For the few who could sense it, the horror wasn't in being trapped. It was in being unnecessary. If every reaction could be replayed, then awareness itself was optional. Consciousness became decorative, present, but irrelevant. They wondered how long it had been happening. Minutes? Hours? Longer? Without new events, time lost its markers. Cause and effect blurred until they felt theoretical. The future no longer pulled at the present. It simply mirrored it. One realization spread quietly among those who noticed. The loop did not exist to punish. It existed to preserve. Something had gone wrong upstream, something that normally fed reality its next moment. And until that failure was resolved, the system had chosen stability over progress. Better to repeat than to risk error. Better to loop than to collapse. The world continued speaking, moving, reacting, convincingly alive. But underneath it all, the same second was playing again, and again and again. Not frozen, not broken, just looping, patiently waiting for something new to arrive. Time moved. Reality didn't. At some point in the afternoon, the separation became undeniable. Time was still advancing. Reality was not. Clocks continued their quiet authority, second hands sweeping forward without hesitation. Digital displays refreshed obediently, numbers changing as they always had. Phones vibrated with reminders. Calendars updated themselves, sliding the present into the past with mechanical confidence. Everything that measured time insisted it was moving, yet nothing that used time seemed to go anywhere. Actions no longer produced futures. They dissolved the moment they were completed, leaving no residue behind. You could send an email and feel the brief satisfaction of having done so, but the world behaved as if the message existed in isolation, acknowledged perhaps, but never allowed to alter what came next. Cause had been severed from effect. People still made choices. They stood at intersections, selected routes, spoke words with intention. But every path led to the same outcome. Every decision arrived at a familiar endpoint, as if the universe had already chosen and was merely allowing participation as a courtesy. Time moved forward like a conveyor belt. Reality stayed in place, like an object being carried along without changing shape. The sensation was subtle at first, a feeling that consequences were delayed, then postponed, then quietly erased. Effort lost its edge. Achievement felt weightless. Failure carried no sting. Without accumulation, experience flattened into a single extended moment. It became clear that progression was no longer being computed. Normally, the present consumes the past to produce a future. One moment feeds the next, building complexity through interaction and consequence. But now the system behaved differently. The present repeated itself with microscopic variations, enough to maintain the illusion of flow, but never enough to generate something genuinely new. Time was no longer a river. It was a treadmill. You could walk as long as you wanted. You would never arrive anywhere else. For most people, this was strangely comforting. Stress evaporated. Anxiety lost its teeth. Without a future that demanded preparation, the mind relaxed. Without consequences, guilt softened into background noise. The day felt lighter. But for the few who noticed the mismatch, it was terrifying. They felt it in the gaps, those fractions of seconds where something should have happened but didn't. The pause after a decision, waiting for the world to respond. The silence where impact was expected, the sense that reality had stopped listening. They tested it in small ways, dropping a glass, expecting surprise. The sound came, the shatter occurred, but nothing followed. No reaction, no disruption. The moment absorbed itself and returned to baseline, perfectly intact, as if the universe acknowledged events but refused to incorporate them. Time recorded everything. Reality remembered nothing. History was still being written, but the ink never dried. The past existed only as data, not as influence. Yesterday could not shape today, because today was not allowed to differ. It was then that a more unsettling thought emerged. What if time was never responsible for change? What if time only revealed change, while something else, something deeper, actually generated it? And what if that deeper process had stalled? The clocks did their job faithfully, advancing markers along an empty sequence, but the mechanism that normally filled those markers with novelty, divergence, and consequence had gone silent. Time kept count. Reality stopped creating. This explained the smoothness, the perfection, the absence of friction. Without new states to calculate, the system reused existing ones. Stability replaced evolution. Repetition replaced risk. The universe had chosen the safest possible option, not forward, not backward, but sideways, sliding endlessly through the same configuration while pretending to advance. Those who sensed it began to feel unmoored. Without a future to lean toward, identity weakened. Who were you if nothing you did could change what came next? What meaning survived when growth was impossible? They realized that hope required uncertainty, and uncertainty was gone. The world no longer asked what happens next. It only asked, how long can this last? Time answered relentlessly, second by second, minute by minute, proving that duration did not require progress. You could exist forever inside a moment that refused to evolve. And maybe that was the most disturbing discovery of all, that reality didn't need to break to fail. It didn't need glitches or chaos or collapse. It could fail quietly, politely, and visibly by continuing to move time forward while leaving everything else behind. Time moved, reality didn't. And unless something restarted the process that turned moments into futures, this separation would persist, clean, stable, and endlessly repeatable. A universe still counting, with nothing new left to count toward. The ones who noticed. They were never meant to notice. Whatever mechanism kept the world moving without changing had not planned for witnesses. It assumed compliance. It relied on habit, on distraction, on the quiet agreement people make with normality every day. And for almost everyone, that agreement held. But not for all. The ones who noticed did not share a single trait. They were not smarter, not more educated, not more important. There was no demographic pattern, no shared profession or age. Some were observant by nature. Others barely paid attention to anything at all. A few had spent their lives chasing meaning. Others had avoided it. What united them was not awareness, but friction. They felt resistance where none should exist. A delay between action and response that lingered just long enough to be felt. A faint desynchronization between intention and outcome. The world answered them, but not quite in the right key. At first, they doubted themselves. Everyone does. They blamed exhaustion, stress, screens, too much information, too little sleep. Modern life had trained them to distrust their own perception long before reality gave them a reason to. When something felt off, the instinct was not to investigate, but to normalize it. So they ignored the feeling until it returned. Again and again, in places too specific to dismiss. A conversation replayed with impossible precision. A sequence of events unfolding with the same timing, the same phrasing, the same emotional beats, not similar, identical. They began to test it unconsciously, asking different questions, taking unfamiliar routes, interrupting patterns mid-motion. The world accommodated these changes, but only superficially. The surface rearranged itself, but the structure beneath remained unchanged. Different inputs, same outputs. That was when unease turned into recognition. The ones who noticed felt it like vertigo, not from height, but from flatness. The sense that depth had been removed from experience, that moments were no longer layered, no longer building toward anything, but sliding past in a single plane. They noticed that decisions had lost their weight, not because choices disappeared, but because consequences had. You could say yes or no, go left or right, speak or stay silent, and the world would respond exactly as it always had. Choice had become cosmetic. Some tried to explain it scientifically. They spoke of simulations, feedback loops, processing limits. Perhaps reality was computational. Perhaps it had reached a threshold. Perhaps this was a temporary fallback state, an emergency mode designed to preserve coherence while something upstream failed. Others leaned toward philosophy. They wondered if meaning had always been an illusion and they were simply seeing the machinery exposed. That repetition was the truth, and novelty had been the anomaly all along. A few said nothing at all. They didn't trust language anymore. Words, they noticed, were part of the loop. Explanations repeated just as reliably as behaviors. Every theory felt pre-written, arriving too easily, resolving too cleanly. Suspicion extended even to their own thoughts. Were they thinking freely or just rehearsing awareness? Isolation followed naturally, not because the others were hostile, but because they were unreachable. Trying to explain the problem felt like shouting through glass. People listened politely, nodded at the right moments, offered familiar reassurances, and then repeated those same reassurances later, word for word, as if stored rather than understood. There was no malice in it, just absence. The ones who noticed began to feel like artifacts, leftover variables the system hadn't accounted for. Glitches not in reality itself, but in its audience. Consciousness that refused to flatten, even when flattened reality demanded it. They paid attention to small things, to micro variations that shouldn't exist if the loop were perfect. A breath taken slightly too early. A pause that lasted a fraction longer than before. A sentence that ended with a different word. These deviations were rare, fleeting, and often corrected immediately, as if the system noticed the error and smoothed it out. But their existence mattered, because it meant the loop was not absolute. Something was still adjusting, monitoring, attempting to reconcile expectation with observation. The ones who noticed wondered if they were the cause of the instability or its result. Maybe awareness itself created variance. Maybe the system could repeat behavior, but not attention. Maybe noticing was not supposed to happen because it introduced unpredictability. That thought frightened them. If awareness was a threat, what would the system do to contain it? Erase memory? Reintegrate behavior? Reduce consciousness until it matched the loop? They watched themselves closely, afraid that the moment they relaxed, truly relaxed, they would slip back into compliance. That noticing itself required effort, like holding a thought steady against a current trying to wash it away. Some failed. They felt the edge soften, the tension release. The world became comfortable again, familiar, safe, and the questions dissolved, replaced by the ease of not needing answers. Others resisted, not with rebellion or noise, but with attention. They observed relentlessly, noted everything, refused to let moments pass unexamined. It was exhausting, but it kept them anchored. They began to suspect something important. Reality had not stopped entirely. It had stalled, like a process waiting for input it could not generate on its own. And the ones who noticed might be that input. Not heroes, not saviors, just irregularities. The system did not know what to do with them yet. It tolerated them, adjusted around them, hoped they would normalize. And perhaps, given enough time, they would. But until then, they remained awake inside a world that had learned how to move without changing. They did not know how many of them there were. They did not know if they could find each other. They did not even know if their noticing mattered. But they shared one certainty. If reality ever updated again, if the future ever reconnected to the present, they would feel it first, because they were the ones who noticed when it stopped. The failed update. The idea did not appear loudly. There was no announcement, no collective realization, no moment where the world paused and admitted something had gone wrong. The explanation emerged quietly, assembled from fragments, half-thoughts, technical metaphors, and instincts that felt less like imagination and more like recognition. Reality, someone suggested, updates itself. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Every instant, the universe recalculates its state. Variables shift, probabilities resolve, outcomes branch. The present is not a place but a process, one that continuously compiles the next moment from everything that came before it. And that day, the process failed. Not catastrophically, not in a way that triggered alarms or collapse. The worst failures rarely do. Instead of crashing, reality did what all resilient systems are designed to do when something goes wrong. It fell back. The failed update did not erase the world. It preserved it. When a system cannot generate new output, it reuses what it already has. Cache states, known configurations, proven sequences, stability over innovation, continuity over risk. So reality loaded an older version of itself, one that still worked, one that still looked convincing, one that could run indefinitely without producing errors, as long as no one asked it to create something genuinely new. This explained everything: the repetition, the loops, the smoothness of the day. Nothing felt broken because nothing was broken, at least not in the way people expected. The structure remained intact. Physics held. Cause and effect appeared functional on the surface. Time advanced obediently. But the engine that normally transformed moments into futures had failed to initialize. The update never completed. There was no rollback notification, no visible patch notes, just a silent decision deep within the machinery of existence. Continue using the last stable build. That build contained everything the world already knew how to do: morning routines, conversations, traffic patterns, emotional responses. It did not contain novelty. Novelty required computation. Novelty required risk. And something, somewhere, had decided that risk was unacceptable. The ones who noticed began to understand that reality was not frozen, it was protected, locked into a safe configuration until whatever had gone wrong could be resolved. The loop was not a prison, it was a buffer, a holding pattern. This raised a more disturbing question: what kind of failure would require reality itself to stop progressing? Theories formed, none comforting. Maybe the system that generated possible futures had become unstable. Maybe branching timelines had exceeded some limit. Maybe the cost of calculating outcomes had grown too high. Or maybe something external, something beyond the visible universe, had interrupted the process mid-update. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Reality could no longer commit to the next version of itself, so it stalled. Time continued because time was cheap. Measuring duration required almost nothing. But generating change, real change, was expensive. It demanded information, energy, decision. The failed update meant reality could no longer afford to decide. Instead, it replayed. The present became a loop not because it was stuck, but because it was unfinished. Like software waiting for missing files, the universe kept running placeholder routines, hoping the required input would arrive. And if it didn't, then this version would persist. Not forever. Forever was still a concept tied to progress, but indefinitely. A world endlessly experiencing the same moment with microscopic variation, convincing enough to prevent panic, stable enough to avoid collapse. The most unsettling part was how reasonable it all seemed. Of course a system would behave this way. Of course it would prioritize coherence over advancement. A universe that collapsed every time something went wrong would never last long. So reality chose patience. It chose repetition. It chose to wait. The ones who noticed wondered if they were living inside an error state, not an apocalypse, not an ending, but a pause between versions, where the old world lingered because the new one could not yet load. They wondered what it meant to live inside an incomplete update. Were they supposed to wait quietly? Were they meant to supply missing data? Or were they simply artifacts, consciousness running on outdated code? No one could tell. There were no messages from outside, no confirmation that the update would ever resume. Only the subtle sense that something was still trying, checking conditions, testing readiness, waiting for alignment. Reality was not dead, it was pending. And until the update completed, everything would remain exactly as it was, familiar, functional, and fundamentally unfinished. A world still running, not because it had a future, but because it hadn't been given permission to move on. At some point, the question stopped being whether the loop existed. The question became how long it had been convincing everyone it didn't. A true loop is not repetition in the obvious sense. It does not replay the same hour, the same sentence, the same gesture with mechanical precision. That kind of failure would be noticed immediately. People would panic, systems would break, meaning would collapse under its own weight. This loop was subtler. It allowed variation, but only within approved boundaries, small differences, acceptable deviations, enough randomness to create the feeling of motion without permitting actual departure, like walking forward on a circular path so large that curvature becomes invisible. Lives continued to unfold. Children were born, others grew old, careers advanced, relationships ended and began again. On paper, history progressed, calendars filled, archives expanded. But when examined closely, everything bent inward. Major decisions resolved into familiar outcomes. Revolutions softened into reforms. Crises concluded without altering the underlying structure that produced them. Even grief followed recognizable arcs, processed efficiently, contained before it could destabilize anything larger. The loop did not prevent change. It filtered it. Only changes that preserved the overall shape of the world were allowed to persist. Anything too disruptive dissolved quietly, forgotten, reframed, or absorbed into narratives that neutralized its impact. The system was not hostile to novelty. It was allergic to unpredictability. And unpredictability, it turned out, was the only thing capable of breaking a loop. Those still paying attention began to sense its boundaries, not as walls, but as resistance, a pressure that appeared whenever thoughts drifted too far from expectation, whenever questions threatened to lead somewhere unfamiliar. The resistance did not feel external. It felt like doubt, like fatigue, like distraction, like the sudden, irrational urge to check a screen instead of finishing a thought. The loop defended itself by making attention expensive, because attention created discontinuities, and discontinuities generated data the system could not immediately categorize. Enough of those, and the cached version of reality would no longer be sufficient. That was the risk the update had been trying to manage. The loop was not a mistake, it was a solution, a way to keep existence coherent while something unresolved lingered beneath it, a way to buy time without admitting that time was being bought. The universe was not stuck, it was circling, waiting for conditions that could not be simulated, waiting for awareness that did not collapse into habit. Most people never noticed. Why would they? The loop was comfortable. It rewarded compliance with predictability. It smoothed edges. It offered explanations for everything that mattered, just enough to prevent deeper inquiry. Those who did notice rarely stayed with the realization for long. Recognition was fragile. It faded easily, overwritten by the sheer effort of daily life, bills, responsibilities, relationships. The loop did not suppress awareness directly. It drowned it in relevance. Still, a few held on, not by fighting the loop, but by refusing to let repetition become invisible. They paid attention to small discontinuities, to moments that felt off in ways that could not be articulated, to instincts that suggested the future should have felt heavier than it did. They stopped asking how to escape. Instead, they asked what the loop needed. Systems do not wait without reason. If reality had paused its update, if it had chosen circular motion over forward progression, then something essential was missing. Not energy, not matter, not time, perspective. The loop could not generate the one thing it required to proceed, a viewpoint that existed inside the system yet was not fully shaped by it, a form of awareness capable of observing patterns without immediately reinforcing them. That was why noticing mattered, not as rebellion, not as resistance, but as input. Every moment of sustained attention introduced noise into the loop. Every refusal to default, every decision made without precedent added friction. Tiny local instabilities accumulated, not enough to break the world, but enough to challenge its assumption that repetition was safer than progress. The loop responded by tightening, by making novelty more subtle, by disguising movement as déjà vu, by blurring the line between choice and inevitability. And yet, something shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but incrementally. The loop did not end. It widened. Its curve stretched just enough that forward motion became possible again, even if no one could point to the exact moment it began. The future did not return as an event. It re-emerged as a sensation, an unfamiliar tension pulling gently ahead. Most would never notice the difference, but those who had been paying attention felt it immediately. A faint resistance in repetition, a weight in decisions that hadn't been there before, consequences that lingered instead of resolving cleanly. The update had not completed, but it had resumed, and the loop, once a holding pattern, once a safeguard, was no longer perfectly closed. It was becoming a spiral, still repeating, still familiar, but slowly, unmistakably moving somewhere new. The quiet question. It does not arrive like a warning. There is no voice asking it aloud, no thought that announces itself clearly enough to be examined. The question appears indirectly, slipping between moments, hiding inside pauses where something should have happened but didn't. It sounds simple, too simple to matter at first. If nothing new happens, how would you know when reality moves forward again? Most people never ask it, not because they can't, but because the question requires a specific kind of silence, one that modern life rarely allows. Noise fills the gaps where doubt might form. Motion replaces meaning. As long as things continue to happen, no one feels the need to ask whether they are actually changing. The quiet question waits patiently for stillness, for the moment when repetition becomes noticeable, for the instant when familiarity feels rehearsed, for the uneasy realization that yesterday and today no longer feel distinct. It does not accuse, it does not demand proof, it simply lingers. Those who feel it begin to sense the fragility of their assumptions. They realize how much faith they have placed in continuity, how deeply they trust that movement implies progress, that time guarantees novelty, that the future will arrive simply because the clock says it should. But the question undermines that trust. If reality failed once, quietly, politely, without collapsing, then it could fail again. Or worse, it could appear to recover while still repeating itself underneath. That is the danger of a silent failure. It leaves no scar, no clear before and after, no memory sharp enough to point to and say, this is where it broke. So the question shifts. How would you tell the difference between a future that is unfolding and a present that is replaying itself convincingly? People assume the answer would be obvious, that progress would feel different, that something inside them would register the change. But certainty has a way of dissolving under inspection. How many days already feel identical? How many choices already lead to expected outcomes? How often does surprise genuinely occur? The quiet question does not claim that nothing is real. It suggests something more unsettling, that reality might not announce its transitions, that updates might complete gradually, invisibly, without ceremony. That change could be so well integrated into habit that it passes unnoticed. And if that is true, then awareness becomes the only measure left. Not clocks, not calendars, not events, attention. The ability to notice difference when difference is subtle, to feel when a moment resists prediction, to sense when consequences return, when choices regain weight, when the future begins pulling instead of merely repeating. The quiet question asks whether that sensitivity still exists, or whether comfort has dulled it beyond recovery. There is a final turn to the question, one most people avoid. What if reality has already moved forward again? What if the update completed long ago, but the moment of transition was missed because no one was looking closely enough? In that case, the failure would not be the stall. It would be the forgetting. Forgetting what genuine change feels like. Forgetting how to recognize uncertainty as movement rather than threat. Forgetting that the future is not supposed to feel familiar. The quiet question does not seek an answer. It watches. It waits to see whether anyone pauses long enough to feel the difference between repetition and progress, whether anyone notices when a moment refuses to behave like the ones before it. Because if reality ever truly updates again, not incrementally, not cosmetically, but fundamentally, the sign will not be loud. It will be subtle, a choice that matters, a consequence that lingers, a moment that does not repeat, and only those who have lived with the quiet question will recognize it for what it is. Not disruption, not error, but proof that the future has returned.